So here we go. Welcome to another edition of History Highlights. My name is John McNair. I'm the park historian out at Fort C.F. Smith Park. I am also a park programmer for the Arlington County Department of Parks and Recreation. It is my job to use the parks and historic sites of the Arlington County system to teach Arlington residents and their friends, and even visitors to our county, a little bit about its rich past with lessons that may be applicable to the present or even the future. Today's History Highlights program is one that I personally have kind of been mulling around for a little over a year now. Today, we are focusing on the lost city of Jackson, Jackson City, the federal city that never quite was. Jackson City is a bit of an enigma. It's one of those stories that has been circulating around Arlington for a long time, and even the name can usually conjure a lot of different images for a lot of different people. Jackson City meant a lot of things to a lot of different Arlington residents over the long course of its history. Some of those images that the mind conjures up aren't always positive. Jackson City has a pretty salacious history at times. It has a very enigmatic history at times. It's a very strange endeavor from the moment it's planned to the moment it rather violently comes to an end. Now, today is not meant to be a complete deep dive into the full history of what we now know as Jackson City. We're covering too long of a time range, and quite frankly, any period in the timeline we discuss today could have its own lecture series. There's just too much to dig into. So I want you to think of today as an introduction to the myths, the legends, and the realities of Jackson City. If you have follow-up questions of your own, if there's anything else you want to learn about Jackson City, try and type those into the chat box when we are done with the program. Or I would also recommend doing your own research. Arlington County Historical Society has a lot of good resources on Jackson City, and with the digitization of many historic newspapers, a lot of the information I'm about to give you is really not that hard to access. Now, to begin with, Jackson City. Oh, there we go. Sorry, 1 second. Okay. The new federal city. So to understand exactly what it is that we mean when we say Jackson City, we have to go all the way back really to the year 1824. In 1824, we have a presidential election. 4 men run for president, and all 4 men are members of the same political party. By the presidential election of 1824, the two-party system in American politics, the divide between the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party, had been very much upended. The Federalist Party had really all but disappeared after the War of 1812, and by 1824, the Democratic Republicans really do make up just about all of America's major politicians. Now, in 1824, 4 Democratic Republicans are going to run for president. 3 of them are very experienced politicians, members of past presidential administrations, previous members of the House, of the Senate, but one of them is a relative newcomer. The 4th candidate in 1824 is this gentleman over here to the right, Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson has, by 1824, made quite the name for himself. He is a war hero of the War of 1812. He has attained some notoriety in that regard for a number of things, such as defeating the British just several days after the War of 1812 comes to a formal end, and also for launching an invasion of Spain, which of the Spanish territory of Florida, which really was not meant to be a part of the War of 1812's greater campaign. So Jackson has ruffled a lot of feathers in Washington, but among the people, he's a very popular popular figure. In the election of 1824, he is running on a very populist candidacy. He is basically advocating a very large overturn of the political status quo as Americans know it. And as such, he's very divisive. People have very strong opinions about Andrew Jackson one way or another. So when the election of 1824 happens, because the field is so crowded, no one achieves the requisite amount of electoral votes to attain the office of the president. Now, when you have a presidential election and no candidate receives the requisite number of electoral votes, we don't have the election over. Instead, the election is handed off to the House of Representatives. Now, for the 1824 election, Andrew Jackson thinks his chances of becoming president are quite good. He has the highest number of electoral votes of any of the candidates, and he also has the popular vote. So in his mind, he should be president. But that's not how our system works. The House of Representatives holds their own vote on who is going to be the new president, and the House will ultimately vote for John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams will win the election of 1824 through the House. Now, very tellingly, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, is also one of the nominees for president. And all of the states that gave Henry Clay their electoral votes will switch over to voting for Adams. Once Adams becomes president, he is going to nominate Henry Clay to be the new Secretary of State. So you can see how this would really ruffle the feathers of Andrew Jackson and all the Democratic Republicans who voted for Andrew Jackson. They are going to regard this as a betrayal. In their mind, Henry Clay has sold the election to John Quincy Adams in exchange for that Secretary of State appointment. So from that moment on, there really is this incredible divide over Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson will return to the presidential race for the next year, and in the election of 1828, he will successfully win election. He will defeat the incumbent John Quincy Adams in 1828, and then 4 years later, he will win re-election. So Andrew Jackson will serve as president ultimately from 1829 to 1837. And during that time, the divide among the former Democratic Republicans is just going to get further and further apart. And in fact, even though there are multiple political parties forming and collapsing at around this time, most politicians who run for office will identify on the podium and in the local newspapers as being either the pro-Jackson candidate or the anti-Jackson candidate. Jackson really is going to come to define American politics for this entire period. Now, we had to go on that little journey because to understand why Jackson City comes into being such as it does, you really have to understand the atmosphere around President Jackson. Now, when Jackson is made president, the District of Columbia does not necessarily look like the District of Columbia that we know today. The half diamond shape that we're usually familiar with was actually a complete diamond. It extended not just on the Maryland side of the Potomac, but also over onto the Virginia side of the Potomac, including the town of Alexandria and what is now Arlington County. So when Washington is built years and years and years before the election of Andrew Jackson, it's built on the Maryland side and slowly grows to encompass Georgetown. If you are on the southern side of the district, this leaves you relatively cut off from federal power. So the idea of having a federal city on the southern side of the Potomac, in addition to a federal city on the northern side of the Potomac, is rather appealing to some people. Now, we're not entirely sure when the rumblings for a federal city in what is now Arlington begin, but we do know that by late 1835, we have an association rising in New York City known as the Jackson City Association. They are going to purchase a relatively large tract of land along the southern side of the Potomac from Alexandria County resident Richard B. Mason. Richard B. Mason is a great-grandnephew of George Mason and is one of the only residents living in this area as well. When I say one of the only residents, I don't mean that literally. I mean that in the sense that he is one of the only land-owning residents. Richard B. Mason is also accompanied by a sizable portion of enslaved laborers who are held on the property as well. So there's a lot of open land here for purchase, and the Jackson City Association is going to buy this property supposedly with the intention of building a city that will be adopted as a new federal city, incorporated formally into the District of Columbia. It's a big idea. In fact, it's an ambitious idea. Now, the idea of a new city in the 1830s on the south side of the Potomac is going to be broached directly from the Jackson City Association to President Jackson. The pitch is quite simple. We want to use our money to build a city on the southern side of the Potomac that we will name after you, and that will be incorporated into the district. Well, Jackson loves the idea, and on January 11th, Jackson is going to hold a grand procession across what is now known as the Long Bridge into Alexandria County for a cornerstone laying. Basically, a grand ceremony which will be attended by politicians, prominent men, working associations, educational associations, and no small amount of military associations. If you look at this flyer over here on the left side of the slide, you'll see just how many people are being incorporated into this grand parade honoring Jackson and the city that he hopes to establish. The ceremony that progresses across the Long Bridge and into Alexandria will begin with Jackson himself laying a cornerstone to the city. And beneath that cornerstone is something of a time capsule. According to reports, things like newspapers, articles, medals, commemorations of the day are all placed beneath the cornerstone. Now, also as part of this opening ceremony is a speech from the gentleman over to the right, George Washington Parke Custis. George Washington Parke Custis is the founder of the Arlington House that overlooks Washington, and he is a man who dedicates just about all of his life to promoting the memory of his adopted grandfather, George Washington. George Washington Parke Custis is going to give the keynote speech, and it begins on a fairly idealistic note. He begins, "Our northern brethren have come among us to build a city. They bring with them their wealth, their industry, their spirit of enterprise. Let us bid them welcome." So you can really see that at this point, any kind of frustration among the south side of the district to have a federal city, it's really hoping to be alleviated here. People who really want the southern side of the district to be more connected to the northern side of the district are all in favor of this new plan. And George Washington Parke Custis will outline point for point all the reasons why he at least thinks this is a great idea. And if you read through the entirety of his speech, it really does get quite grandiose at times. He compares the possible Jackson City to being a new city on a hill. He says that it can be the new bulwark against any attack made against Washington should an invasion ever come. In his mind, Jackson City really is the beginning of a new era for the American Republic. And he is very happy that such a city will bear the name of Jackson, who, in his mind, continues the legacy of one George Washington. So, with all this pomp and circumstance and idealism, what can go wrong? Well, a lot can go wrong. Almost as soon as this ceremony takes place, things start to fall apart. On March 29th, 1864, Representative Fairfield of Maine is going to put before Congress a motion to incorporate the planned Jackson City into the federal system. Now, with so many people seemingly on the Jackson side by now, one would think this would have been a foregone conclusion, but getting this motion to approve of Jackson City formally in Congress has a lot of hiccups. For one thing, Jackson has a lot of enemies at this point. He's in his second term. He's burned a lot of bridges, and there's no shortage of Jackson opponents who will want to deny him the honor of having a city named after him. You also have no small amount of moderates within Congress who are still very uncomfortable with the idea that Congress are the sole administrators over the District of Columbia. They dislike the idea that Congress will be used as landlords. It's for this reason that so much of the early district's history is characterized by congressional neglect. Congress doesn't like setting the precedent of regulating communities, at least directly. But then finally, you also have no small amount of Jackson's supporters who are avidly against this idea as well. As much as they love Jackson, they're very suspicious of this New York City-based committee coming down to the Virginia side of the district and buying up all this land in speculation. They view this as a scam, and they are very offended, outspokenly so, that this scam would try to get itself passed through Congress by appropriating what they consider to be the great name of President Jackson. So as soon as the motion is put before Congress, there is a subsequent vote to table it indefinitely. That really is sort of the end of the matter. On March 29th, 1836, Jackson City's incorporation into the District of Columbia is tabled. And from that moment on, things really start to get worse. Nobody buys land from the Jackson City Association in New York. So it's going to stay undeveloped for years. During that time, its awkward position just north of the 4 Mile Run, right off of the Potomac River, is going to make it susceptible to any number of poor weather conditions. One of the first things that's going to happen to it in June of 1836 will be severe flooding, which, according to the Alexandria Gazette, is actually going to put the entirety of Jackson City underwater. Now, Richard B. Mason and his enslaved laborers are still the only real residents of the area, and they're going to disappear a few years later as well. In 1841, Richard B. Mason is going to drown in Alexandria while trying to board a ferry. Following his death, as was sadly often the case of many plantation owners in the South, the enslaved laborers who lived in the Jackson City area as well are going to be auctioned off in a trust sale, and they will disappear from the region as well into perhaps even a worse state of slavery. So just over the course of 1 year, the limited population of Jackson City is going to disappear entirely. So not only is there no new construction, but the old construction starts to fade away. Now, as sort of a caveat to that, during the advertisement for the trust sale, R.G. Saunders, the trustee in charge, will note that the auction is going to take place at Lee's Tavern, which was the residence of Mason in the area. Keep a note of that, because this is also one of the earlier mentions where we have of Jackson City somewhat being synonymous with drinking. Again, more on that later. But following this gradual decline, Jackson City is going to start becoming the butt of a lot of jokes in the popular local media. Just about everything I'm showing you here is from the Alexandria Gazette, the main Alexandria-based newspaper. So by July 6th, 1842, or excuse me, by December of 1843, we have this Jackson City in Ashes headline, in which, really the writers of the Alexandria Gazette are sort of having a little bit of fun at the expense of both Jackson and the idea of Jackson City. It just goes to show that really by the end of the Jackson administration, there really is a concerted effort by the Jacksonian opponents to keep that legacy in the past. From this moment on, not much is going to happen in Jackson City outside of the occasional joke in the local newspaper. For another 10, 15 years or so, if Jackson City is mentioned, it's going to be mentioned as a humbug. Humbug is the word that is used by the local newspapers. It is a word that is used to mean a bad deal, a scam. On one occasion, a newspaper writer will actually use the value of a house in Jackson City to be his synonym for something that is worthless. It's not a very spectacular moment, but it's not the end. Jackson City is going to have a small revitalization in 1861. At the outbreak of the Civil War, the Union Army is going to use the area around Long Bridge to build several fortifications for the purpose of defending Washington. At the Virginia side of the Long Bridge, they are going to build a small dirt fortification pretty much surrounding the railroad that now crosses over the Long Bridge and into Virginia. They are going to refer to this earthwork as Fort Jackson. Now, most of the Civil War forts around Washington get their names from the Union soldiers who build them. Some of them name their fortifications after their homes. Some of them name their fortifications after their commanding officers or of prominent politicians like Lincoln. Some of them will name their forts after heroes from their home state. So you get a really good sense of identity with the Union Army fortifications in Arlington. Interestingly, the fort that's built at Long Bridge is called Fort Jackson, named after Jackson City. As far as I know, I think this is the only time a fortification in the defenses of Washington is named after the neighborhood in which it is built. Very telling, since this is, at the time of the construction, a southern neighborhood. Now, Fort Jackson is built because it's believed that Fort Runyon, the next fort over just to the south, needs a little bit of extra defenses to cover some less than defensible portions. So all of a sudden, we have this new idea of federal construction south of the Long Bridge to revamp the existing Washington line. It really is almost a parallel to the original plans for Jackson City. Now we have an ambitious new addition to federal authority on the south side of the Potomac. But much like Jackson City, Fort Jackson never really comes into being either. When Brigadier General John G. Barnard writes his report on the defenses of Washington after the Civil War, he has very little to say about Fort Jackson, and none of it is good. He will refer to the fort as having wet ditches. He will say that it quickly falls into disrepair and that it really had no armaments or no garrison. No cannons are ever placed inside Fort Jackson, and the few soldiers who stand there are really just outstretched picket guards from a much smaller garrison on the DC side of the Long Bridge. In this photograph here, we see a photograph of Long Bridge taken from Washington. So the two guards that you see here probably would have had a few contemporaries on the other side of the bridge, and really that was the extent of Fort Jackson. By 1865, Fort Jackson is going to be one of the first fortifications in Arlington to be decommissioned because there really is just no point to keeping it up, even before the war comes to its formal end. Now, after the Civil War, this is when Jackson City really starts to develop the reputation that many Arlingtonians have probably heard of or know it for today. Starting in the 1880s, Jackson City is going to develop a reputation for being the site of a number of bars, saloons, and gambling houses in Alexandria County. Now, the real issue here is not necessarily that Jackson City is this pariah of Alexandria County life, but more how it's a pariah. You see, Jackson City is not unique in being a portion of Alexandria County home to an abundance of saloons and gambling houses. You see this in Roslyn. You see this a little further up closer to Chainbridge. It really is something that starts to take over Alexandria as a whole at the start of the 20th century. Drinking and gambling is considered to be a rather big problem in Alexandria County at the outset of the temperance movement, or the anti-alcohol movement that will lead into Prohibition. The gentleman to the left side of this slide is Commonwealth Attorney Crandall Mackey. Crandall Mackey is going to be elected to the office of Commonwealth Attorney for his stance against what he considers to be corruption and immorality in Alexandria County. Now, Crandall Mackey is a very controversial figure. On the one hand, like I said, he's being elected on what many consider to be a no-nonsense law and order reform ticket. But Crandall Mackey has a very uncomfortable view on what that entails. He is of the opinion that much of the corruption we see in government is the result of African American enfranchisement. He is also an avid supporter of mob violence when it is directed by the legal authorities. In fact, this is how he is going to take care of what he considers to be the problem of Jackson City. On March 30th, 1904, Crandall Mackey is going to authorize a raid against a number of the drinking and gambling establishments in Alexandria County. This raid is going to start at 5 p.m. in Jackson City. Much has been made of the quote-unquote burning of Jackson City, and it's a little hard to tell fact from fiction all these years later. But what we can tell from contemporary accounts is that a mob of prominent county citizens, very open white Virginians, deputized by the Commonwealth's attorney, will make their way towards a single gambling establishment in Jackson City. Now, they will arrive at the Jackson City gambling establishment, they will force all of the patrons out, and then they will proceed to destroying many of the gambling tables and overturning just about every barrel of alcohol that they can find. Local newspapers will place the damage at about $2,000. On the one hand, this might seem like a very limited interaction. From Jackson City, they're going to move on to Roslyn, where they will do this to a number of other houses as well. Again, at face value, we have this citizens' war against immorality in what is now Arlington. But when you look a little bit closer, there's maybe a bit more of a nefarious edge to it. When Crandall Mackey's mob arrives in Jackson City, they are going to enter a gambling establishment that at the time is filled with African Americans. They are going to drive them out of the establishment, and according to one newspaper, a sheriff's deputy will fire a weapon at least one of them as he is running away. So the burning of Jackson City, it really can't be underestimated that the story of it really is sort of held in the eye of the beholder, and different generations will come to remember this quite differently. Is this a moment when Alexandria County residents take back their county from the vices of drink and gambling? Or is this a moment when an otherwise racist government system is actually making moves against a community that they do not agree with on racial grounds? It's a very uncomfortable moment in our county's history, but one that we cannot turn away from. So what does that leave us with today? Well, nowadays, what we now know as Jackson City is actually very well developed. And if you want to get a good view of it from all sides, I definitely recommend going to visit Long Bridge Park, one of the many, many Arlington County parks that you can find in the area. Long Bridge Park is a great site. It's got playing fields where you might see some of the teams from Marymount University have some of their games. It's got a very nice walking trail from which you can see the Roaches Run Waterfowl Sanctuary, do a little bit of walking, do a little bit of bird walking, and we do have a spray grounds there as well. So there's a lot to see and there's a lot to do at Longbridge Park. Longbridge Park is also the site of what is going to be a new aquatic center. The aquatic center is under construction. The construction of the Longbridge Aquatic Center was scheduled to complete in the second quarter of 2021. Now, if the little story I've told you there has been an indication of anything, it's that building projects in Jackson City do seem to carry with them an air of bad luck. And I can assure you that just about everybody in the Arlington County system hopes that that bad luck does not befall the construction of the Aquatic Center. However, it's very telling that in the last year of construction, our country experienced a pandemic. So with that in mind, it seems like there really is never any shortage of construction troubles that come to Jackson City. That being said, fingers crossed that we can finish that aquatic center in a timely manner, and that the relatively cursed legacy of Jackson City may come to an end. Now, like I said, that really is just sort of a brief overview of the many different stories, the many different details that contribute into the modern day myths of Jackson City. Much more to study there, much more to learn, and unfortunately I am not necessarily the best person to do that, but I can offer a little bit more guidance. So here's what I'm going to do. I am going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen. So hopefully everybody should be seeing my face again. If you have any questions for me regarding Jackson City's very complicated history, go ahead and type them in the chat. I'm happy to answer them. We've got about 10 minutes left in the formal program, so if you want to stick around and ask questions, that's great, but if you are all done, feel free to check out now.
Yeah, I just want to make a comment about Jackson City.
Go for it.
This is, and Roslyn too, this is particularly what happened after the Civil War into the early 20th century. This is typical of many cities. On one side of the city, I think you have the big city, New York City. On the other side, you have Newark. It had the East St. Louis and St. Louis, Memphis and East Memphis, all over the place. It's the other side of the tracks. In this case, it's the other side of the city, because this is where the city starts to clean itself up. You know, Russia still had plenty of vice after the first Civil War, which came in after the Civil War. And they tried to get rid of it, not that successfully. Anyway, because of the pressure, people just moved across the river or the other side of the tracks. So it's kind of a typical thing of what was happening everywhere. So it's kind of interesting that Arlington finally overcame this, because this thing, like in Newark and East St. Louis, it keeps on going on and on and on. It's a very interesting situation when you think about it.
You know, that is a good point. This is a very typical story for regions that have a major city right next to them. My family, half of my family is born and bred District of Columbia residents. The other half is from New Jersey, and I'm sure just about everyone here in the comments has their own pet New Jersey joke. So yeah, very, very grateful that Arlington County in recent years has been able to shake that reputation. Anybody else?
How do you access these historical newspapers if you were interested in doing some research?
Oh, a very good question. So how am I doing this research? Where do you look? So if you are interested in looking at the historical newspapers that I've posted, or just historical newspapers in general, I recommend going to chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. Again, that's chroniclingamerica.loc.gov. This is a website that is put up by the Library of Congress, and it compiles digitized versions of newspapers from across the United States. I think the earliest newspaper in their collection dates back to 1793 and extends up to the 1960s. So it's not a perfect collection. More is being added to it every day, and there are newspapers digitized out there that are not part of the collection. But as a free newspaper archive, you really cannot do much better. So definitely visit chroniclingamerica.loc.gov to learn more about any part of America, really at just about any moment in its history. Good question. I see we got a question here in the chat. Who built the first houses in Jackson City? Okay, very good question. So in terms of Jackson City, capital letters federal city, the first houses are never built. And that's one of the things that you learn when you really do a deep dive into Jackson City mentions in the contemporary newspapers. By the 40s, by the 50s, writers are still making fun of the fact that no houses have been built in Jackson City. In fact, the only house in Jackson City is the house of Richard Mason. So you really can't stress enough that Richard Mason and the enslaved men and women on his property really are the only residents of Jackson City. And when he dies, they disappear from the records.
What is the relationship between Richard Mason and the Mason of Mason's Island?
All right, very good question. So, what is the relationship between Richard B. Mason and George Mason? So, Richard B. Mason is George Mason's great grandnephew. So, George Mason was the brother of Richard B. Mason's grandfather. He is a very hard person to learn about because the Masons really did have, 3 or 4 family names that they circle through all the time, and each child has 7 or 8 children of their own. So there are multiple Richard B. Masons, and they all have roughly the same lifespan. I got my start volunteering at Historic Sully, where I got to learn about the Lee family. I thought they did it bad, but honestly, it is nothing compared to what the Masons do. You need a little bit of time and a little bit of patience to really map out the Mason family tree in detail.
Really, which Mason the Mason Island was? It wasn't the original George Mason; it was somebody else. And when it was, I don't know, son's daughter, whatever. So you really don't know the actual George person that was.
Sorry.
The Mason of
Mason's
Island.
Which Mason is Mason's Island named after?
Yeah.
That is another good question. I do not have that one handy. It is either George Mason III or George Mason IV. Nobody before that has patented land in the Arlington area, so it's not immediately clear to me. That's not me saying it's not out there. I just do not have that in front of me.
So we don't really know how he's related to this Richard Mason of the Jackson City thing. It's kind of
again. There are too many Masons for me to keep track of, and they all have basically the same name.
It's a common name anyway.
Yep. Indeed. Okay, so we have another question here. When were the first saloons built? That's another good question. And again, one that's kind of vague. I did come across one newspaper that really highlighted the career of Crandall Mackey and highlighted his campaign against the drinking and the gambling in Arlington. And according to that newspaper, the first real saloon kind of this period crops up in 1885. I don't know if that's necessarily true. That's just sort of the story that's put out there at around the time that Jackson City ends up in the local Commonwealth attorney's crosshairs. But if you'll remember, when Richard Mason dies and his obituary is, or his trust sale is published, one of the things they note is that Richard Mason's house was formerly known as Lee's Tavern. So even in the 1840s, people probably associate Jackson City with drinking. I don't know if that's how it starts formally or not, but it's something to definitely consider. When does Jackson City's raucous history really begin? We may never know.
Was there a racetrack near there?
Was there a racetrack near there? There was a racetrack connected to the Jackson City story. in fact, the story goes that part of the reason Jackson City and many of the other gambling establishments were able to avoid being raided for so long was because they had an extended communication network that began at the local racetrack. Now, I admit that I do not know exactly where that racetrack is. It is part of the greater Arlington area, but it's not part of that confined little Jackson City space that we're talking about.
Yeah, I believe.
All right, folks. Well, it is now 7:45. That ends the formal timing of the program. So at this moment in time, I will stop the recording. Again, if you missed part of it, if you're cut out at any point, you should receive the link to this program either tomorrow or no later than Monday. If you want to stick around because you have a few more questions, feel free to chime in. I've got a few more minutes before I head out. But in the meantime, again, this was John McNair from Fort C.F. Smith Park. I hope you had fun. I hope you learned something, and I hope to see you at the park soon. Have a good night, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. It was a good talk.
You're welcome.